how do we think about what makes sense to reintroduce to our diets, but also whether it makes sense to use a supplement like Fatty 15?
Yeah, Chris, it's a great question. And so, the first part is, okay, let's undo the damage that's been done. So we know that we had a healthier state than we are today.
Let's link up with Krista on The Fix. She's a wellness coach with a focus on mental well-being and physical strength.
Stephanie, welcome to the Fix podcast. I'm really excited for this conversation. You are actually my first guest after a string of 4 solo episodes. So happy to have another face on the show for this month and have somebody to converse with. And I'm really excited because we're talking about such an important topic. I'll be a little cliche here for a second and say it's an essential topic, right? Since we're talking about fatty acids and different functions of the body. And I will leave you to get into all of those details. But before we get going on the science aspect of this, I have to know, as a guest on my show, what's your go-to coffee order? What are you sipping on in the morning to get your day going?
Yeah, Krista, great to be here. And my favorite drink in the morning is same as you, is coffee, and specifically a flat white, which I'm drinking out of this
nice
Star Wars Boba Fett kind of.
Love it. Do you make your own flat white or do you go get it somewhere?
We have a wonderful device that makes flat whites for us, which is amazing.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yes.
I can tell you guys. Yeah, I can tell you guys are coffee aficionados if you have a machine that's making your flat white. So we're in good company for sure. That's awesome. Cool. Well, let's get right into it. As I mentioned to you before we hit record, when I have a guest come on The Fix, I want to know your background, your story, talk about what it is that your company is doing and all of the research tied to it. But there are a lot of podcasts out there. There are tons of things for people to listen to. And I think it's really important to kind of take it to that deeper level and to that next level in asking not only who you are, but why should the Fix listeners continue to listen to the rest of this conversation? And why should we care about what you have to say, what Fatty 15 stands for, all of it?
Yeah, well, I kind of already gave it away by the fact that I'm drinking out of a Star Wars mug. I am a nerdy do-gooder.
I love that.
Been humbled throughout life I specifically pursue science and pattern recognition, but the bigger picture is that throughout my whole life, Krista, things haven't always gone the way that I expected them to. And every time that has happened, the opportunity that has presented itself because of that unexpected, that didn't happen, but then something unexpected happened. Those unexpected things have been amazing, have opened my life, have opened opportunities to the point where now I seek opportunities every time, as the minute that something doesn't go exactly the way I think it is, able to quickly pivot. And it has created a joyous, adventurous life that has been incredibly rewarding. And I hope that it's inspiring to others that, just follow the path that is laid out before you. Find the new ones when they present, and you never know what surprises might be waiting for you and discoveries.
This is why I'll toot my own horn and say, I'm so glad I came up with this question to ask it, because I always just get such an unexpected answer. And, having the chance to have met you prior to this and talk a little bit about what you do and your career path and where you've been, I would not have necessarily thought you were going to say that, because obviously most of our conversation originally was about understanding C15, which we're going to explain to the listener here in a moment. And I also would love for you to just kind of share your work history and your experiences working with dolphins. It's so cool, right? But to hear you say that it was very unexpected, I think is very interesting, because I would just assume that for the type of path you've had and for the type of research that you've done, a lot of it you woke up maybe when you were like 9 years old and you were like, I want to be working with animals. I want to be a veterinarian. So before we do talk about C15 on a more personal level, would you mind expanding on that a little bit? Like what has been really unexpected for you about your path?
Right. Well, I can start with which people may know if they've heard of their conversations, but like this discovery that as you shared, Krista, is came from dolphins, from me working at the Navy, and
Yeah.
I don't know how to swim. So clearly,
Really?
I'm terrified of water. So clearly, this was not like a set plan from when I was a kid, and it's just one of those things where you let life's opportunities be presented and you
Sure.
so I can say that as a child I've always loved pattern recognition, just a nerd
Okay.
kid in that way. And thought I was going to be heading toward medical school as an undergrad. And then I read a book by Laurie Garrett called The Coming Plague. And then I was like, what? There's actually a job called an epidemiologist that looks for patterns. Like you could get paid for this. This is great. So hence I went out to pursue becoming an epidemiologist, which is like to
Cool.
track diseases. So I became a veterinary epidemiologist so I could understand diseases, not just in one species, but many. That really helps with pattern recognition and translational medicine. So then I went to veterinary school at Tufts, then got my master's in public health down in Atlanta while I was working at CDC and with the World Health Organization. Then about 20 years ago was unexpectedly invited by the US Navy to help care for, understand a long-lived population of older Navy dolphins. So yeah, that,
Really cool.
who knew that
Who
was
would
going
have thought, right?
I thought I'd do that for a couple of years and instead ended up being there for 20. And that's where then everything really came full circle, because as we were learning more and more about optimizing the health of aging dolphins, the dolphins gifted us with a surprising discovery that is now having a positive impact on fixing nutritional deficiencies for humans globally. So thank you, dolphins. And so then
Yeah.
now spun out a company in cooperation with the Navy and to be able to help bring this discovery to the world.
That's incredible. And you're right. Thank you to the dolphins. And just let's talk about the nutritional deficiency piece first. I know that this is a really critical time because there's obviously new research that's come out, and we'll talk through what that new research is. But I think it's important to just kind of give context to this conversation. When most people think about nutritional deficiencies, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably vitamin D, right? Like everyone knows we should be taking vitamin D. I have so many clients that I'm like, they ask me questions about supplements. And that's usually like the couched answer of like, if you're only willing to take one thing, like, please do this one thing for me. And second to that, the other one that can often come up is something around taking fish oil. And I wanted to bring that up with you personally because this has really changed my mind about, is fish oil the right thing to be taking and what we should probably be doing instead. So let's kind of talk about first, what is a nutritional deficiency? Because I think people need to understand that before we then talk more specifically to C15.
Right. Okay. So this is great. So with regard to a nutritional deficiencies, these are really rare, but Krista, like you named, we know them well.
Yeah.
Vitamin D deficiency and rickets, vitamin C deficiency, and scurvy, like back in the pirate days. Right. So it's been 75 years since a nutritional deficiency syndrome has been identified. And so that's what we just published in the peer-reviewed journal Metabolites maybe a month or so ago.
Okay.
And where we showed that deficiencies in C15 were causing a disease. So that's a key part of a deficiency, is first that you are deficient in a nutrient that your body must have, and our bodies don't produce enough of. So it means that if we don't get enough from our food, from our diet, that we actually develop some type of well-defined disease that's explained all the way down to the cellular level, that then is completely reversed once you put that nutrient back into the body. So very few, like this is a very rare thing. The great thing about nutritional deficiencies, Krista, is that they are fixable, right? The disease exists because you have a lack of this nutrient, put the nutrient back in, and the problem is fixed. So this is that's why we're most excited about this discovery.
Now let's talk about it from that supplementation perspective and understand why, in this case, the nutritional deficiency even came to be. What's changed about our diets? Where are we getting C15 in our environment from, so that we can actually, truly supplement with this, and in this case, rely on supplementation like fatty 15.
Right. So, if we talk about, like, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution in London, vitamin D deficiency and rickets were discovered back then because there was so much pollution in the sky in London that the sun couldn't make it down to the children on the sidewalks.
That's so crazy.
Isn't that crazy? So there was this natural, I shouldn't say natural, there was this human-induced experience that then caused enough of the population to be affected that they were seeing these children with bowed legs that they named rickets, and they realized it was because they weren't getting exposure to the sun. Plus,
that's so wild. Like I've lived in China, so like to think about the pollution from that perspective is like, I believe it, but that's like on a whole nother level.
So that's how that was discovered. For vitamin C, we all know about the pirates and scurvy. They'd be out on ships for a long time, no access to citrus. They didn't get enough vitamin C. They developed, gum disease that then was called scurvy. And they realized, I'm trivializing it, but bring oranges onto the ship with you and you don't get it. So then when we fast forward now to C15, C15 is this odd chain fatty acid, this essential fatty acid we discovered while working with the dolphins. And the experiment that has happened with us as a population with C15 is that over the last 50 years, we've methodically reduced population-wide our intake of C15 from our primary source, which is dairy fat. So 1977 in the US, Congress, which is crazy thinking, Congress came out with nutritional recommendations.
So crazy. We could do a whole podcast on that.
We had, senators and representatives releasing dietary recommendations for all Americans, saying that every American needs to reduce their intake of all saturated fats. And the main way to do that is by decreasing our intake of whole dairy fat and butter. So that really set the stage of reducing not just the bad even chain saturated fatty acids. We now know that there's these this Goldilocks odd chain saturated fat that is in the mix and of C15, and which has benefits and is so beneficial, it's essential. So when we took butter and whole fat milk away from our diets, we accidentally induced basically this 50-year experiment of taking C15 out of our lives. The result of that has been, and now we're seeing, especially in the generations that have grown up from birth into this kind of C15 deficient world, we're seeing increased incidence of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and cancers in younger and younger people in their 30s and 40s. Fatty liver disease is a disease that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or MASLD, it's now being referred to, didn't even exist before 1980.
And I didn't know that.
Right? Yeah. So it was initially discovered by Mayo Clinic. They reported the first 20 cases in a journal. And then today, 1 in 3 people have this fatty liver disease globally, 1 in 10 children. So that showed up out of nowhere. And then with regard to an entirely new way for our cells to die called ferroptosis was discovered by scientists at the University of Columbia in 2012. And they discovered, when we go to cell biology class, they teach you, okay, there are 3 ways that your cells die, and that's it. And that's what we've always been told. This group discovered a 4th way, an entirely new way that our cells were dying that was very specific. They called it ferroptosis. There have been over 10,000 peer-reviewed papers published on ferroptosis, but nobody has understood, Krista, like, where did it come from and why is it happening? So what we now published in this paper is this all happened, ferroptosis, which causes accelerated aging, earlier onset of all these diseases I've talked about, that all of this is caused by a lack of C15 in our cell membranes. So it's been, really a 10-year science journey and a 50-year experiment on all of us to really uncover endorphins to help us uncover this deficiency syndrome.
Now, I just find this so fascinating because, as I shared with you the first time we spoke, I have a lot of my own theories about like the correlation between low fat diets and that trend as a fad. And I see this a lot on an anecdotal level and like my own little like research study, we'll call it, with all of the clients that I've supported over the years. I can tell you, just to piggyback off of some of the stats that you shared around non-alcoholic fatty liver, while I've never had a client formally diagnosed with it, I do see a pattern in their blood work where something is not right with their liver enzymes, and their doctor immediately wants to ask them the question, do you drink a lot? What's in your diet? And everything you said, I'm like, yeah, this makes perfect sense. Yeah. I also think there's something to be said for the fact that and I say we because I see this with my clients, I fall into the age range that you're describing of people who were literally born into, not really having a lot of whole milk and whole fat food sources like that in their diets. But I would even say I'm still probably on the cusp of like the group of kids that did drink milk, where that's like completely gone away. And I find it very interesting that became such a popular mode, and like low fat yogurts, low fat cheeses, low fat this and that. And now we're seeing my clients that I work with in their 40s, they're experiencing these menopausal symptoms that are technically perimenopausal. They're a little on the younger side for menopausal age, though that obviously depends on a lot of other factors. And I've just always kind of thought to myself, so as I continue to see this as a pattern, I'm like, there's got to be something going on between like low fat, this and that, and what's happening hormonally over here. And you had said to me, I brought this up to you, and you were like, you're onto something for sure. And this research that you guys have found really kind of speaks to why this may be happening. So I think that's really fascinating. And from there, what I'd love to ask you is, somebody might be listening to this and their first thought would then be, oh, do I need to run to the grocery store and start buying like, goat milk and those kinds of cheeses and full fat yogurts and all of that? How do we think about what makes sense to reintroduce to our diets, but also whether it makes sense to use a supplement like Fatty 15?
Yeah, Chris, it's a great question. And so, the first part is, okay, let's undo the damage that's been done. So like, we know that we had a healthier state than we are today.
Sure.
Right. And that was fixed before there was a world with Fatty 15 in it. So our pure C15 supplement. So step one is, we're really saying, hey, the abundance of literature, this is not just our study. There are now dozens and dozens and dozens of studies. We try to make it all available at discoverc15.com is where all the peer-reviewed science that we keep up to date on that site. So you can go look at that.
We'll link it in the show notes too.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. So the first step is like, let's right a wrong. And, we're really encouraging as far as with nutritional recommendations, pediatric teams, physicians, to be able to really look in World Health Organization, look at our dietary recommendations and really evaluate the C15 science to say, hey, are we really doing the right thing by saying remove these whole fat milks and dairy fats from our youngest kids, right? For infants, infant formula has no C15 in it. And if moms are C15 deficient, so is their milk. And we know that babies that get less C15 from mom, that they have poor growth. They have a smaller skull size, which is diameter, which is indicative of brain development. And they've been tracked in France, a study in France over 6 years, and that these children are not developing cognitively as well if they have lower C15. Wow. So let's fix that by getting whole fat milk, when appropriate, back into the youngest children. So then the next question is, okay, so then as we move on from let's say teenagers through the rest of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
The big question here is, okay, there have been so many studies done on dairy fat and health. And for the most part, it's been biased against dairy fat, right? Because everything is talked about. And the studies are very mixed. It's just a mess. But I do think there are more and more people understanding that, hey, most studies support that if you do drink whole fat dairy milk and you eat butter, that it's not as bad as we thought it was. I think the science is at least there. Where it definitely is not is drink milk and you will be healthier. Like you will have better metabolism. All the things that C15 does with regard to improving and balancing our metabolism, our immunity, our liver health, that the studies do not in any way consistently show that just by simply increasing our dairy intake that we get better. And so there was actually a group that got together in Denmark, and there were experts in nutrition and dairy fat. And they had the same question, Krista. And it wasn't about C15, it was about other nutrients in milk.
Sure.
Right, that were beneficial in the lab. When you took those individual ingredients, they did amazing things in the lab and in clinical trials. But once you mixed it with milk, back into milk, you didn't see those benefits. So they met over 3 days. And because the mantra is always get your nutrients from, the best way to get your nutrients is from food.
Sure. Yeah. That's why I wanted to ask you this. Yeah.
And in most cases, that's true. But what this group found, and that we're seeing the science that's consistently coming out about C15, is that the nutrients have strength on their own. But when you mix them in, because like, for example, dairy fat has over 400 fatty acids in it.
Wow.
Only 1% of milk fat is C15. More than 40% of fatty acids in milk fat are pro-inflammatory, these pro-inflammatory even chain saturated fats. And so what they concluded based upon a review of all the science is that sometimes these core beneficial ingredients just can't compete against the ones that are
dominant.
Exactly, especially when you talk about taking it beyond childhood for our whole, like for decades and decades, for a century.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that it dilutes the effect. So that's why we developed Fatty 15 in cooperation with the Navy. This pure C15, bioavailable, science-backed, patented supplement that is at the exact doses that we know that people need to get, but without having to compete with all these pro-inflammatory saturated fats. This is the same ingredient that, all the studies that have been done on C15 are with this ingredient. So you're not kind of like left with, a certain food is good for you. Therefore, if you take the supplement that has this ingredient, it's good for you too.
Sure.
Actually on this ingredient. So that's why we developed it, is like, let's get to the heart of it so we can not only get back to where we were, but we can actually optimize nature and C15 to actually not only get better and restore our health, but we can actually further extend our health and longevity better than we could have before Fatty 15 world existed.
Yeah. And I definitely want to touch on next, like the longevity comment that you just made, but just to clarify, with what you mentioned about that particular study around milk, is it correct in then saying that with like some of the pro-inflammatory aspects, a lot of that or some of that may even have to just do with like production of food today, and how like the other ingredients that, I'm not even just talking about milk, but like if we talk about all dairy products, right? Other things that are being included in our food, I would imagine maybe contributing to why something like C15 is not as like effective in that container, so to speak, in our diets. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. And you're bringing up a really good point, which is not only, does C15 have to compete, unfairly against all these bully, bad fat, just even going back to the 1950s, right? But today, getting to your point, the changes in production. So we know, for example, that even if you have whole fat milk, that if the milk is coming from a cow that eats grass and just grass, it has twice as much C15 in its dairy fat than a cow that is fed corn.
Wow.
We even know that there's a difference in the amount of C15 in their dairy fat, depending upon the height, the altitude of the grass fed to the
Yeah,
cows.
that's wild.
So it's like and seasonality and breed. And so we
Mhm.
can no longer just count on like whatever milk or butter that you're taking off the shelf. It's no longer a given how much C15 is in that, even though it's a pure whole fat, for exactly like the point that you brought up, that industrial changes have made it more variable with regard to C15. So one of the things we're encouraging is for for dairy products to actually report the amount of C15
Yeah.
in a product. And heck, like if I'm looking at, we can drive consumer demand because of all the science to say, hey, I'm going to pick the product that has the highest C15, maybe highest C15 to C16 ratio. Like it has,
Sure.
so it's like kind of this omega-6, omega-3 ratio
Mhm.
that will likely play out for dairy food as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And just to move on again to what you were about to get into around this longevity piece, can you talk about having proper C15 levels in the body, what that does for you in terms of mitigating risk for some of the disease, like we touched on with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? I know another big one is type 2 diabetes. And I know that I've heard you talk about other research around blue zones and looking at the population in Sardinia in particular. And I thought that was so fascinating. I actually just had a call with a client right before we hit record on this, and the timing was just perfect because she's a newer client of mine and her fat content just across the board could be a little bit higher in her day. And one of the things I was saying to her was, you are probably a product of the low fat cottage cheese, low fat yogurt generation. And you can, like, you have room, even if you have a fat loss goal. And that's where people get stuck because, like, they think it's competing calorically, right? And they're like, I want to achieve this fat loss goal. But you're behind in this, like, don't be afraid of the whole milk yogurts. And there is a little bit of fear around it. And I get it. So let's talk about it beyond the like aesthetic conversation and getting more into the goals of longevity, and tell me a little bit more about what's been shown in having higher levels of C15, how that can support us to live longer.
Yeah, so this has been a really exciting stage, right? So it's like, gosh, not only do we get to talk about fixing nutritional deficiencies, through dietary changes, through fatty 15 supplementation, but to be able to leverage nature to optimize nature through this pure ingredient to then help us live even healthier longer. And this came from working with Dr. Nick Shork, and he's head of the NIH's Longevity Consortium, and he's been there for, 15 years. And Nick has seen everything. Like, he's seen all of the longevity enhancing compounds and all the science behind them, which is great. And so when Nick was seeing all of the essential roles that C15 was playing, that it was strengthening cell membranes, it was repairing mitochondria, it was helping cellular signaling related to metabolism, it was inhibiting mTOR and activating AMPK. Like, Nick is like, Steph, I think we're sitting on a geroprotector.
Yeah, like there's something magical here, right?
Right? They're like, this isn't just like, oh, a good nutrient to get back into your life. He's like, I think we're actually leveraging C15's natural way that it's tapping into known, well-established longevity pathways that fatty 15 is allowing us to perhaps do better than leading longevity enhancing drugs. So with that hypothesis, Nick and I did a study, and the work was done by an independent third party. And they basically, it was a panel called Biomap, and it's 12 human cell systems that mimic various disease states. And they measure 146 different biomarkers. And what you do is you treat these diseases in a dish with your different compounds, and you treat it at 4 different concentrations. And that allows you to do, and this is what pharma companies use all the time, not only to measure the efficacy and safety of your compound, your pure compound, but you can benchmark it, you can compare it to others. So we did that study and we compared it with rapamycin, metformin, and acarbose, which are three leading longevity enhancing compounds. And we published that work in Scientific Reports in 2023, I think. And what that study showed, Krista, was that C15 had the most clinically relevant cellular benefits of all of them. And it most closely resembled rapamycin, which came in second.
Wow.
So C15 had 36 significant dose-dependent benefits. Rapamycin had 32. And then when you step back further to where, okay, what do we care about? That both of these compounds have anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic, anti-cancer, antioxidant, and even antimicrobial properties. And so you look at that, and having this toolkit, right, being able to fight off infection, bacterial and fungal infections and cancer, development of cancer cells, and all of these things are going to help you live longer and healthier.
Sure.
Right. And then so that's what we reported. And Nick just presented at the Aging Research and Drug Discovery, ARDD meeting in Copenhagen. It's like the world leading, longevity meeting with all the bigwigs there. And that's where Nick presented C15 as the leading nutrient and compound, which was a lot of fun.
That's incredible. And before, we keep going on like the benefit aspect too, I want to make sure, I meant to ask you this question earlier, but just kind of unpacking the concept around cellular fragility. You just touched on why it matters in mentioning some of the aspects of the benefits of like what it can do for your metabolism, fighting off disease, potential reduced risk for cancer and all of that. But talk us through, for somebody who's like, should I even care about this? Like, should I even worry about this? I've heard you actually say this on other podcasts of like, well, if I can't feel anything going on, like, do I really actually need to be concerned? So let's make sure we touch on that too.
Sure. So let's start. We're all built out of cells, right? So every part of our body is made with cells. And so obviously cellular health is core to healthy aging and keeping us healthy. As we age because our cells become more fragile and they stop doing the jobs they need to do. That is how we age. And there are these things called hallmarks of aging, which actually define right at the cellular level how we age. So when we look at longevity and aging interventions, they're all targeting these various hallmarks of aging. So C15, we know today, and it keeps, the list keeps getting longer, Krista, as people do more and more studies. So it's up, C15 is now up to targeting 6 hallmarks of aging.
Wow.
Great. So a core one is stabilizing our cell membranes. So in order for our cells to be healthy, that armor around our cells has to be intact. And the stronger that cell membrane can be, the longer our cells can stay young and healthy and keep us working. What happens is our cell membrane is made of a bunch of different types of fatty acids. And it's one of those cases where we truly are what we eat. Yeah. So the fats that we eat are directly reflected in the fats that make up our cell membrane. We can influence the structure of our cell membrane with dietary changes within as little as 5 days.
That's crazy.
It's super shocking. Like I was shocked to see those studies. But if you move from a high fat to a low fat diet, within 5 days, your cell membranes are now reflecting those fat changes in your diet. So what's important is that our cell membranes have these different fatty acids. We know about unsaturated fatty acids or polyunsaturated fatty acids like omega-3 and omega-6. Those are really good for flexibility. They have double bonds in their structure, which allow them to be flexible. So these are important. But the problem is as we get older, especially as we get older, but through our whole lives, those double bonds are also weak points that are susceptible to attack by oxygen.
Okay.
Oxidative stress.
Yeah.
And that is a major driver of disease and aging. And the older we get, the more susceptible those double bonds are to oxidative stress. So if we have a lot of those unsaturated fatty acids in our cell membrane, that makes it susceptible to fragility and attack. So C15's role, what we've learned is that we have to have at least, in fact, we need to have more than 0.2% of all the fatty acids in our cell membrane needs to be C15. And it serves truly as a sturdy fatty acid that has no double bonds, and it serves like a brick in the armor of our cells to help keep them stable. As soon as we have less than or equal to 0.2% of C15 in our cell membranes, the cell membranes become fragile. They get attacked by oxygen, and that leads to this whole new form of cell death called ferroptosis. So it ends up, there's even a theory of aging, and it's called the cell membrane pacemaker theory of aging.
Wow.
That was introduced by A.J. Holbert before us. And what he showed, he did some really cool studies, Krista, where he showed the more stable a cell membrane, as in the more stable the fatty acids in the cell membrane, the longer mammalian species lived. So humans have more stable fatty acids than a mouse. So he explained longevity just through strength of cell membranes. The stronger our cell membranes, the longer we live. So now it is, let's leverage C15, get higher C15 levels into our cell membrane to then help us live not only longer as a species, but as individuals.
And the other part that's so interesting is like, you don't even need that much.
No,
like,
it's so little.
Yeah, like 0.2%. But it also just shows you like, it's that, okay, I don't need that much of it, but it's so important that I would also imagine it's like, with everything we've been saying, it's very sensitive to the fact that you don't need that much. You have all these other acids, like we've been talking about with the milk example that you gave, that are competing with it. So it's important to, I'm sure, be consistent with sustaining that supply. And I'd also want to know, because you mentioned this before with getting into like the idea of like, we need to correct the problem. How low like are people who, pre-fatty 15 and starting to take fatty 15, like how low are people coming in? Like what is kind of like the average range for population?
Right. Great question. So the average range of people in the US and other developed countries is about 0.2%. So we're all sitting, most people are sitting right on that cliff of cellular fragility. So it may be that you feel fine, but as soon as a challenge comes or that this aging process is accelerating, but like you said, and then all of a sudden menopause shows up earlier than it should. So it's like this insidious process that's happening over decades. So when we're sitting right at that edge. So the goal now is to say, okay, if we went back to the diets of the 1950s, right, and we and all we did was put milk back in and whole fat milk, that would get us to maybe like the 0.25 to 0.3 range. So which is like gets us further away from the cliff. But you had mentioned we're also still kind of battling with the competitive fatty acids. So what provides us great hope is the Sardinian population, right? So this is our wonderful blue zone, blue longevity zone, the island of Sardinia off of Italy. And they have the most men who live over 100 in the world, and as well as a lot of women living over 100. When you look at their C15 levels, Krista, they have an average of 0.4 to 0.6.
Okay. So it's like double.
Yeah. And so they, so when we looked into how are they, which, supports stronger cell membranes, they're going to live longer. When we looked into their diets, it ends up that they have replaced meat with cheese. So they're eating less meat, and they eat maybe meat once a week on Sundays and special occasions.
Yeah.
And they eat cheese, but it's not just any cheese. They are at this really unique advantage of their cheese comes from their local goats and sheep that are in a mountainous region. So those goats and sheep are eating high altitude grass. And the cheese that they make is a really hard cheese that one of them is one that we know, most people know as pecorino. And pecorino has twice as much C15 as even butter, the normal, butter fat from cows. So Sardinians show that we can get there, like we could have healthy ratios. And I should mention that they're less likely, they're living longer because they're less likely to die of heart disease, which is still the number one killer of people globally. So it does show that we can, and that I should mention those levels of 0.4 to 0.6% match a large scale cohort study that was done by folks, including Harvard, where they looked at these giant populations, not Sardinia, but globally, multiple countries. And they showed that people who had C15 levels between 0.4 and 0.6 were the least, had the lowest risk of developing heart disease.
Wow.
So it all tells, so it means
Fair.
that we can get there, but it's getting difficult if you don't live in Sardinia.
Right, because of the other variables you're talking about. Exactly. That's why I wanted to bring up the point about like understanding our food supply, understanding our environment, and like basically it's like I was going to make this joke earlier when you were talking about like how to get things from your food versus the necessity for supplementation. And I was going to say, like, basically what I'm hearing from you is we all need to like go live on a farm and know exactly where our food's coming from, because we're literally the ones handling the animals, taking care of them, right? Like, it's like that's not realistic for everybody. So we need to come up with a solution for that. And that is something like Fatty 15. The other thing that this makes me think of, have you seen the like this was a trend on Instagram for a couple of weeks, and it may be like very niche to my Instagram algorithm as a nutrition coach, but there was a joke going around that I think you'd really appreciate. And it was people biting into like bars of like Parmesan cheese and like the, you know, like hard Pecorino cheese. And they were saying like, this is the new, like, screw protein bars. Like, I found a source of protein that is twice as much protein for the same amount. It doesn't have a ton of carbohydrates and it's good for me. And these people would just take a bite out of the cheese. And it kind of speaks in a funny way. It kind of speaks to what you're saying.
It's perfect. Yeah, I love that. So we, you know, for me, like you again, so we partnered. So C15 can be tested, and it's been able to be tested in our blood by any physician who has access to a fatty acid panel.
Okay.
To make it even easier, too, that's kind of your first option. You want to do that with your physician, with your healthcare provider, so that you can make decisions about your C15 regimen. But for those folks who maybe don't have access to it, we then, through a physician, we work with Genova Diagnostics to develop an at-home C15 test, which is great because that really helps guide, like, where am I at? I don't shy away from dairy. I have cheese and a whole grain, non-processed cracker, and without giving away the name, it has like 3 ingredients in it, right? So it's like truly you could see the grain. Yep. So and I eat that with and that's my snack every day of the cheese and crackers, and I have my flat white, so I'm not shying away from dairy there, which is a 2%, and then I take my fatty 15 and I'm at Sardinian level, so I have 0.46 levels, which is great. And, you know, which is able to, I think we could only get so far with C15 in the diet, and that fatty 15 really helps us get could help accelerate fixing a deficiency, but just as excitedly, it can help all of us be able to get into that Sardinian zone.
Totally. And I'm really glad you mentioned, you know, bringing your physician into the piece of the puzzle, because I'd love for you to speak to this too. Both you and your husband had mentioned to me that one of your goals and something you're actively pursuing is more of a partnership with doctors to be able to get them to prescribe something like Fatty 15, just as you would like any other kind of like supplement regimen or medication. And I think that's fantastic, because I feel like it's a step in the shift towards really helping the medical field understand how to be more proactive. And this has always been a hot topic on my podcast, where I have had somebody come on who is in the medical space and says, like, we live in a world that's very reactive, especially when it comes to healthcare. And if that was just something we could change, like, we really change the state of our health. And it's very easy to blame a doctor for being like, oh, you should go on this medication and do whatever. But at the same time, it's also how they were educated. So there's this responsibility to be like, at what I tell my clients, especially, is, you know, you may, even when I ask them to get certain lab testing, Like you may need to be a little aggressive about asking for what I'm asking you to get done, but explain to them like why we're doing this. So you're working with a nutrition coach and there's a sentiment behind it. And it's simply just because like they were trained that you see a certain disease state, you respond with this type of intervention, right? So just kind of talk me through why you obviously feel as a company that it's important to start at this level and have those partnerships, because I think it's fantastic.
Well, thank you. And you're helping with all of that, right? By educating, your clients and getting them to talk to physicians. I mean, interestingly, we have a healthcare providers program that we've developed, and it was created out of demand. So
Cool.
what was starting
That's
to happen was that their patients were taking Fatty 15. They didn't know it. But then the patients were going in, they were getting their blood work, and they're like, what? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, like you're looking good.
Like your liver enzymes just drop, because these are physicians who've been seeing them with chronic conditions.
For years.
Right?
Yeah.
For years. They put them on medications, done all these things, and they know what their normal is, and they come in and they get their blood work done, and they see improvements in cholesterol or glucose or liver enzymes. And they're like, what are you doing? And they'll say, oh, I started taking Fatty 15. And enough of that groundswell kicked in, Krista. And then there was another group, Dr. Seeds had been reading our science, and he has a community of functional physicians that he supports. And so he reached out to us and he's like, I think this is going to be one of the most important discoveries for physicians to be able to help the patients. So he's like, tell me more, come and present, come talk to our physicians. And as we started sharing the science, then the physicians are like, we need to provide this to our patients. How can we help that happen? So that was the inception of Healthcare Providers Program. The really nice thing about Fatty 15, and a reason why Dr. Nick Shork, right, the longevity expert, is so excited about C15 is it's not like, oh, go get your telomere length measured and and see if your epigenetic clock is slowing down, which it does do that too. But it's more like, is it having clinically relevant benefits that your doctor cares about?
Yeah.
In months. And that's what we need, right? And so not kind of like cross your fingers and hope that you live longer. And so we really do encourage people, and working increasingly with a growing number. We now have hundreds of physicians who are partnering with us, who we encourage people, go get your blood work before you start Fatty 15, or know your baseline. Take Fatty 15 for 3 to 6 months, and then go get your blood work rechecked. And now that there's a C15 test readily available that your physician can access, or you can, that can help guide, because it's really going to be a personal journey based on what your C15 levels and what you want to achieve. It might just be, hey, I just don't want to be deficient because I have 0.06 and I'm supposed to have at least 0.21. And there are others that are going to be like, hey, I have 0.25. I want to go Sardinian. So the ability to guide dosing 1 to 2 capsules a day, and then also like, oh, maybe I'll throw some pecorino in, and you can guide your journey responsibly. And most importantly, not only have clinical trials now shown that Fatty 15 successfully raises our C15 levels, that it results in clinically relevant benefits, which if you take Fatty 15 and you get above this 0.2%, this critical threshold that a placebo-controlled clinical trial just published last month showed that it successfully lowered liver enzymes in patients that had fatty liver disease.
It's amazing.
Yeah, and probably most importantly, it also increased hemoglobin, which is a sign of that cellular strength of the red blood. So a lot of exciting things happening.
Now, one other thing, we've obviously talked about the longevity aspect, and, by like process of understanding how systems of the body all function together. And like, if I see certain blood markers changing, I would imagine there's going to be an improvement here, but I know the average person doesn't always understand that. And I want to ask you about gut health, because that's obviously a hot topic. In the same like range, I feel like if you were to search like the top things that people are talking about, like longevity and gut health are like the two big ones that are up there these days. And in you mentioning the improvements to people's blood markers around things like their insulin, liver enzymes, and what that means, I'm curious, is there any specific research, or do you just have any thoughts on just kind of understanding how like these markers kind of like indicate certain things about how deficiencies in C15 or then taking something like fatty 15 can actually improve people's gut health?
Right, is such a great and important question. Krista, if you had asked me this 6 months ago, I would have been like, that's a great question. We should really be doing research on that. So,
Yeah.
but just in the last 6 months, there's a lot that has come out on C15.
Cool.
So the first is, and there's a study that was literally published on September 8th.
Oh, nice.
So
like not even 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
Yeah, that was not from us, completely independent. That was published in the journal Nutrients, and they actually used fatty 15, unbeknownst to us, but great.
Cool.
So they used fatty 15 in a mouse model of inflammatory bowel disease, of IBD. And in fact,
Wow.
it was 2 mouse models with 2 different forms of IBD. And what they showed was that supplementing the mice with fatty 15 at 2 doses, that's equal to our 100 and 200 milligram dose in humans, but calibrated to mouse weights, that they showed that dosing, both of those doses successfully lowered inflammation in the gut, and it improved the histology, the health of the tissues. And importantly, a big part of getting to your point with regard to gut health is reflects our whole body health.
Yeah.
Is right that there's the leaky gut hypothesis, right? So we know that when our gut lining and tissues are unhealthy, that the connection between our cells along the gut lining get weak, and becomes leaky. And that means that all these foreign things that we're putting into our mouth and goes through our system that our intestines are not supposed to let through, when we have leaky gut, all these pro-inflammatory instigators make it across this leaky gut lining that induces chronic inflammation, which then sets up everything that we've talked about. So what the study showed was that not only did fatty 15 supplementation in mice decrease inflammation, but it also tightened up. It stopped the leaky gut issue. So it actually tightened up the junctions. So
junctions, yeah,
and that was
that's massive.
And that was the second study to show the pure C15 ingredient did that, from 2 independent groups. So that's a huge, like you said, that's huge way of protecting us at the gut level. There was a clinical trial done in Singapore with pure C15 supplementation. And in that study, they showed that the women, it was for women with that had high body weight. And it showed that the supplementation with C15 increased, not only lowered the LDL cholesterol, but it increased growth of this bacterium called Bifidobacterium adolescentis, which is like this mother of all microbes in our gut, which help to balance our metabolism and immunity. So there are a lot of ways we're understanding that C15 really does have, as an essential nutrient, nature's just put it to work in so many different important ways.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And that's very cool that they used fatty 15 without you even knowing.
I know. I was reading this because obviously I'm reading up on the C15.
Anything C15. Yeah.
And every 3 to 4 weeks, there's a new study. It's just
incredible
out in the world. So I was reading this one just 2 days ago, and I was like, are you kidding me? So they're like, oh, we used fatty 15 for this. I was just like, oh, that's great.
Yeah. Now, to your point about the research just over the years and as it's continued to come out, I want to bring this back a little bit to what you said at the very, very beginning of this conversation, just around how like your life had unexpected turns, and thanking the dolphins for this gift that we've kind of discovered accidentally, right? We know that when it comes to research, it requires a lot of support and a lot of funding. And if that's not there, these things don't happen. And just given your resume and the roles that you've had over the years, how much would you attribute those accidents kind of happening for you to really where C15 is going, and really fatty 15, I should say, just even as a company and being in existence, like how much of a role do you think that plays in the story of even creating fatty 15 as a product? Because I know there's lots of people out there who are like, yeah, I'd love to do research on this. I hear this so often, especially in the female population, because as you know, from being in this world, when it comes to nutrition, women weren't even studied until like the 90s and included. And I think that's obviously a problem. But I'd be curious what your take is on that, just like from the perspective that you have from all of the positions that you've held in your career.
Yeah, I think it's a mix, and you'll hear this, we hear this all the time, but it really is true that being able to make it this type of discovery and to bring it to the world effectively over the past really 20 years has been a mix of luck and diligence and vigilance with regard to really holding to the highest standard and always following the science, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that we needed to see C15 work not only in one study or two studies, but 10 years of studies, epidemiological, cell-based, a receptor-based, dose-dependent, benchmarking, all of that had to come together. And it was to the point, Krista, that after 10 years of science, our own advisors stepped in and they're like, hey, you're good. Like
this,
it's time.
It's time.
We're like, but you're talking about a dolphin veterinarian.
Yeah.
Telling people, like, coming out with the message of a saturated fat and butter that's good for you. Like, we have to make sure that this is right.
Yeah.
So it's because of the challenge of all of that. And, with regard to the accidents, the whole study with the dolphins was, we were seeing dolphins that were aging healthier, faster versus slower.
Okay.
And so when we used this, broad technology called metabolomics, it allowed us to look at thousands of small molecules in their diet, all fish diet, and in their bodies to see which small molecules predicted the healthiest aging dolphins. Krista, we went in with the bias that it was going to be omega-3s that predicted the health, because it's like they eat fish, for goodness sake.
Right. And that's been the messaging, like, for everybody for so long, right?
Yeah. And so we're like, we went in with the bias, and it was only C15 had not been included in these types of panels until just a couple of years before. So had we done this study
years
2 years earlier, C15 wouldn't have ever showed up, wouldn't have made the discovery. But it was only because the timing where we happened to do this this study that happened, was funded by Office of Naval Research at this time. The panel included C15, and it not only proved our biased hypothesis wrong, that omega-3s didn't even make the list of predictors of healthier aging dolphins, that lo and behold, we had this surprising saturated fatty acids pop up. And there are like 10 examples of that on this whole journey. So it was about trusting the science and really holding true. And if something didn't prove out, you moved on, right? That you're okay on letting go of something.
Sure.
The science stopped supporting it.
Yeah.
Like us with omega.
Hard. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was, that was a big lesson.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I want to be respectful of your time. But before we let you go, I, of course, have to ask this question so you can share it with the audience. How did we arrive on the name Fatty 15? Because I know it's kind of like a fun story. And it's obviously the name itself gets your attention.
It does. Yeah. We thought we were going to be advancing this as a pharmaceutical, as a drug for fatty liver disease and anemia. And so that's why we developed this pure, pharma grade ingredient. But as the science came out, and it was showing as essential, we then realized we had this, we were told we had this moral obligation to bring it to the world. Mm-hmm. So the best way to start doing that is through a supplement, taking this ingredient and putting it as a supplement. And so, Krista, where all of a sudden we go from being, veterinarians, and my husband's a physician, to supplement brand market.
You're like, this isn't our wheelhouse exactly.
That was not in the plan. And so we went to a great team of brand marketers and, they had done big brands, not supplements. And we shared the science with them, and they're like blown away. Like, this is going to be world changing.
Yeah.
You need to come up with the brand that's going to, reflect that. So they gave us we were sitting in their big boardroom. They put out little index cards with like 50 different names. And the first card we removed from the table was fatty, because we're like, here's what we're not going to call it. Right? Like that. Okay, that one is out. But then we started talking about it. And as we talked more and more about it, we're like, it actually gets to the heart of what we've discovered.
Mm-hmm.
And that we decided we're going to call it Fatty 15, so that we add a little more science behind the name, and that we would evangelize the word fatty, so that we can take it so that it is not an insult, and it's not things that my mom said. It makes me want to cry because I think of my childhood and mean kids. I'm like, we're going to evangelize that.
I love that perspective.
It's no longer a bad word, that this is a word that fats can be good, fats can be bad, and Fatty 15, is gonna help improve global health. So sorry, fatty doesn't get to be a bad word anymore.
I think that's great. I absolutely love it. And on that note, tell everybody, if you listen to this and you don't want to get your hands on Fatty 15, I think you should listen to it 2 more times. But where can everybody get it? Like I mentioned earlier, we'll definitely link the site for the research too, if people are interested in understanding more of the literature and exploring that on their own. But we'll put all of this down in the show notes.
That's great, Krista. So yeah, you can go to fatty15.com. is where you can learn about the supplement and all the things behind it. Lots of fun stuff. If you dig into the menus, we have our TED Talk there about the discovery in dolphins. And then discoverc15.com to nerd out on all the C15 science.
Amazing. Well, Stephanie, thank you again for your time today, but also for your dedication to all of this research and this journey, and for all that luck and those happy accidents to get us to this point where we are now today, for us to even be sitting here having this conversation. I really appreciate it. And for everybody who listened to this today, you guys know that this message rings true for every episode that we have. If you benefited from this in some way, please share it. But I think I couldn't think of a better episode to emphasize the heck out of sharing, because this obviously is important for everybody's health and longevity. And I don't know a person who wouldn't benefit from listening to this. So share it with someone, put it up on your Instagram story, tag us so that we know that you listened to it. And from wherever you're listening from, as always, we hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, Stephanie.
Great. Thank you, Krista.